The unbelievable act of kindness. Why this young black man helped an elderly white woman cross the street. Nelson had just returned from Iraq, where he had spent 5 years serving in the army, to learn that his adopted mother, Dr. Solivia, had passed away in the hospital. The pain of this news was so heavy for him to bear, because she was the only family he had in the entire world. He had promised her that he would not die on the field, that he would come back to see her and take care of her till her last breath. He was ready to keep his promise, but it seemed like fate had other plans. Nelson had lived most of his childhood in foster homes after he lost both his parents in a car crash at age 5. He stayed in government-provided homes for 4 years until he was adopted by Dr. Solivia, a pediatrician who loved children and cared for them all her life. Nelson was extremely lucky to be picked by her, and that was the main reason his house mistress at the foster home tried to prevent it from happening. Being a black kid in a majorly white-dominated American foster home, the chances of Nelson getting adopted seemed slim. But Dr. Solivia, a white woman, chose him as the child she wanted. "Are you sure you want this one?" came Miss Magdalene, the house mistress, an obvious bigot and racist. She had treated Nelson particularly poorly, not because he was ill-mannered or misbehaved often. He was treated differently simply because of the color of his skin, and Dr. Solivia could see this. "We have plenty of other kids, you know," said Miss Magdalene, hoping Dr. Solivia would buy it. But thankfully she did not. "I want this one," she replied. And when Miss Magdalene finally left to get the rest of the paperwork ready for Nell's adoption, Dr. Sullivan approached him. "What is your name?" she said, smiling. She probably already knew because she had studied the history of most of the children at that foster home. But she only wanted to start a conversation with him. "Nelson," he replied softly, hesitating a bit, but warming up to her beaming smile soon enough. "All right, Nelson. I will soon be taking you home, and you can call me Mommy from now on." The words had some meaning to Nelson. He remembered having his parents vaguely, but this woman right here who wanted to play the role of his mother didn't look anything like him. He had black curly hair. Hers was long and blonde. His eyes were dark brown. Hers were bluer than the sky. His skin was darker than the black dress she had on, but hers was as white as his set of teeth. But despite these differences, he could not deny the feeling of love and warmth he experienced just being in her presence. At that moment, Nelson realized that he had found himself a mother, and true to her words, she nurtured him and made sure he was well taken care of, physically and emotionally. The day he told her about his plans to join the army, Nelson couldn't understand why she broke down into tears. She couldn't bear the thought of him dying in the army, but he promised her that he would not because he had something to live for back home. He had a mother to return to. 20 years after his adoption, Nelson found himself at the gravesite where Dr. Solivia had been buried by the state after she passed 2 months ago from lung cancer while he was still redeployment in Iraq. Tears trickled down his eyes as he tightly gripped the roses he had brought to her grave to pay his last respects to her. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much." He paused a bit to wipe his tears before he continued to speak. "I am so sorry I never got to tell you I love you one last time, but I will continue to live by the principles you have taught me." Nelson put down the flowers and walked home slowly, thinking of ways to immortalize the memory of his deceased mother. and coming to the conclusion that the best way to do this is to live a life based on her principle of love and kindness to all. After setting the house in order and making a few changes to everything, Nelson decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood. While growing up, he experienced a lot of racism, as he was the only black kid on the block, and he couldn't understand why at first. "Why am I always getting bullied by people, Mom?" he would ask Dr. Sylvia anytime he got the chance. She would reply while stroking his head gently, "They are ignorant, Nelson. Just ignore them and avoid them. Not everyone is like that." Nelson found her statement to be very true later on in his life. His best friend in the army who took a bullet to save him was Caucasian, Georgie Frank. Thankfully, he survived, and Nelson was able to drag him away from the gunfight. Several colleagues who were all white treated him with love and respect. Even his girlfriend Maggie, who was in college in a nearby city, was white too, so Nelson wasn't about to be fooled by the actions of a few bigots. He only hoped that the neighborhood where he grew up had gotten a little better in the 5 years he was away. As Nelson strolled that morning, he found himself reminiscing about the old days. Just then he saw a kid running towards him, holding a remote that controlled the movement of his toy car. The boy was only about 4, and he seemed to have wandered out of the grocery store nearby. He was clearly oblivious to the danger of the open road. But as the boy wandered close to the road, Nelson rushed forward and held him. "Hey, little man, what's up?" Nelson said as he carried him up. The kid mumbled some unintelligible words and pointed at his remote. Nelson could see he had messed up the gears on his remote control and helped him set it properly. And the car started moving in the right direction, causing the child to giggle with pure joy. Just then, a big white dude stormed out of the supermarket wearing a jacket and a face cap. His face turned pale as soon as he saw Nelson holding his child. He went from him, yanked the boy from him, and cursed loudly. "How dare you touch him?" Nelson replied, "It's nothing serious, man. I saw your kid close to the road and waited for his parents to come around." But the man wasn't having it. He pushed Nelson a little more before storming off. This behavior didn't deter Nelson from keeping to his principles. He realized that some people could be closed-minded. One should never use a part to judge the whole. A quote that Dr. Olivia always used to buttress her point on issues like this. Every morning, Nelson would take a warm-up jog across the neighborhood with his headphones playing his favorite pop music. Each time he came across a particular house, the property looked abandoned. The weeds all around were bushy, and the lawn was overgrown and needed weeding as soon as possible. He knew someone still lived there because of the red car he saw parked in the garage. For the first 3 days, he ignored it. But when he learned that it belonged to an old white woman who lost her only son, who was a Navy officer many years ago, and now lives alone all by herself, Nelson made up his mind to take care of her, even if indirectly. That Sunday morning, Nelson didn't go to church. He stayed back, and when he was sure the old lady wouldn't be around, he came with his wedding gear and started work on the entire place. He borrowed a lawnmower from someone, and after intense work, the place was looking as good as new. He hurriedly packed up to leave when a neighbor asked him who he was. The lady who lives here paid me to do some cleaning up around here," he replied. "All right, good job," the man said. Nelson didn't see the man's face, but left happy that he was able to help. He didn't want any reward for it, so he avoided passing that particular street for some time. One day, He was strolling as usual on the way to the supermarket to get groceries. After getting all he needed, he spotted a very old lady trying her best to cross the street. The street wasn't that busy, and only a few cars were on the road. But this lady was so elderly that crossing was posing a difficult problem for her. Nelson, immediately he saw this, dropped his groceries and ran over to her, helping her to gently walk across the road with her walking aid, taking each step at a time, doing his best not to rush her as onlookers stared in respect and disbelief at the kindness of this young black guy. "Thank you, dear," she replied as Nelson boarded a cab for both of them after she told him her address. By the time they arrived at her place, it turned out to be the old lady's place he had cleaned up for free. As he helped the lady out of the car, a tall, slim man came out of the house close by to see the old lady and immediately exclaimed, "Lisa, I thought you said you didn't know the guy that cleaned up your place." "That's him right there." Lisa turned around slowly to look at Nelson, who was a little embarrassed after getting his cover blown by the guy who saw him the day he came. "Are you the angel that mowed my lawn and cleaned up my yard?" she said, smiling. Nelson confirmed it, explaining that he only did it because he understood that she needed help and that doing it cost him nothing except a little effort, so he didn't want to be recognized for it. Lisa appreciated him and invited him to come over that evening so he could have dinner with her. Nelson agreed, and that evening he came over with a bottle of grape wine. They greeted each other, and after they ate, they decided to take time to chat about themselves. "I'm 82 years old, and ever since I lost my son who served in the Navy 10 years ago, I have lived all alone. But as the years go by, I find that I can't manage on my own much longer," Lisa said, wiping the sad tears that trickled down her eyes. Nelson drew closer to comfort her before she continued, "Thank you so much for today and for helping me with my yard, God. I prayed for someone to come help me while I was in church on Sunday, and by the time I came back, it was all clean, like a miracle." Lisa's eyes beamed with joy as she spoke about the events of the night and how she moved to the neighborhood from the main city. Nelson also began talking about his life and upbringing, and by the time he started talking about the loss of his late mother, he got a little emotional, and even Lisa began to sob. "Oh child, it must have been very hard for you," she said, looking at him with genuine concern. He nodded his head in agreement and continued speaking about his time in the Army and how he now lives a lifestyle based on the values and teachings of Dr. Olivia. Lisa and Nelson had dessert and talked some more before bidding themselves farewell. From that day, Nelson always came around to see Lisa and make sure she was all right. He cleaned her yard, helped her get groceries, took her to her doctor's appointments, and he practically became her son and helper. Lisa, on the other hand, would cook Nelson delicious homemade dishes, not as payment for his help, but just to show her appreciation. During this time, Maggie finished college and came around to see Nelson. She was so overjoyed to find out he was moving on fine from his mother's passing. She saw how well he took care of Lisa. Maggie, being the angel that she is, joined him in helping out with chores and taking care of Lisa. They took turns to cater for her and hung out together whenever they had free time. Nelson was convinced he was with his other half, as it was obvious she had a big heart like he did. He was a lucky man. She wasn't only beautiful and supportive, but she was also kind, loving, and generous. and everyone noted just how perfect a couple they were. Soon, everyone in the neighborhood began talking about just how well Lisa was being taken care of by Nelson and Maggie. One day, while Nelson watered Lisa's flower garden in the yard, Craig, Lisa's neighbor, the man who spotted Nelson the very first time he came to help Lisa out, came to meet him at the yard. "Hey man, how are you doing?" Craig said, standing behind Nelson. "I'm good, bro. Just watering these flowers." It seemed like a casual chit-chat to Nelson until Craig asked another question. "Why are you helping Lisa? You don't even know her?" Nelson paused for a while before responding. He knew he had to give a good answer to the question being posed to him. "Well, maybe because several years ago, a white woman who didn't know me from anywhere in this world decided to adopt me and shower me with love and kindness and raise me to be the man I am today." He finished and continued watering the flowers. Craig was deeply touched by this answer. He just stood there. Nelson, who had been bent over for a while as he watered the flowers, stood up straight to add, "I can't see a mother who needs care and support and just look away until her last breath. I will look after her." Craig was moved indeed and extended his hands for a handshake. "Humanity needs more people like you." He paused for a bit before adding, "I left her to struggle for months, knowing she needed help. I now see that being of the same race offers nothing. Good people come in all shapes and sizes and colors." Craig ended and walked away, inspired to be a better person. Nelson continued to take care of Lisa for the rest of her life, and on her 89th birthday, he hosted the celebration at his place, and a year later she passed away. At Lisa's birthday celebration, Nelson proposed to Maggie, and she agreed to the joy of everyone present. One of those invited was the family of that kid at the grocery store, who Nelson prevented from falling into a road accident. The man who assaulted them was already aware of Nelson's kind works towards Lisa, and made sure he apologized to Nelson for what he did. And they even became close buddies after that. On Nelson's wedding day, Georgie flew from his state to attend, and even played the role of Nelson's best man. Georgie still limped a bit from his war injuries, but he assured Nelson that he was going to make a full recovery in a few weeks. When Lisa was about to die, she informed Nelson that she wanted to transfer all her assets to his name. But Nelson and Maggie politely rejected, stating that they had enough already, and urged her to instead transfer it all to the orphanages and foster homes around the area, because the kids needed the help more. Lisa did this in her last days with Nelson and Maggie. Nelson eventually got the Medal of Honor from the state government for his service in the Army, and lived for many more years with his wife Maggie and his two daughters, whom he named Sylvia and Lisa, in honor of the mother who raised him when he was young and the mother he supported when she was old. Nelson and Maggie eventually became very rich and decided to start an orphanage where they raised children who had lost their parents. They showered them with love and care regardless of their race and color, and instilled in them the value of human kindness and love to restore faith in humanity. Nelson's story goes a long way to show how one person's kindness can foster a chain of behaviors that will shape society for the better. It all started with Dr. Sylvia, who loved a child of another race. She taught him to appreciate and respect all humans, and this allowed him to willingly help an old lady who had no connection to him without expecting any reward. His kindness allowed her to give all her wealth to children who need all the support the world can provide. ultimately spreading the message of goodwill and human kindness far and wide. And with that, we come to the end of today's story. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end of today's video. Please hit the subscribe button to stay updated on all our latest content.